All right, everybody, welcome to lecture video number 2. Today we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycling, which may seem like a big word, but I promise you it's not as scary as it sounds. Bio means life, geo means earth, chemical, chemicals. The chemicals of life and how they transform throughout earth, how they cycle through earth. So we'll answer questions like, which nutrients are important to sustaining ecosystems? How do these nutrients transform within an ecosystem? And how do humans impact these processes? So ecosystems are going to depend on a variety of resources such as nutrients like food, but also water, energy, and matter. And these resources are going to cycle throughout ecosystems, and you can see these cycles anywhere throughout the globe with all sorts of different resources. Another thing to note is that we call them cycles for a reason. They don't start and end, they're continuously happening. And that's because of something called the first law of thermodynamics, or the law of conservation of mass, which basically states that matter, anything that has mass, cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. The example I like to give is a campfire. If you light a campfire, you put a bunch of wood in, and at the end of the night, the wood seems to have been destroyed. It's gone. Except it isn't. It's been transformed into ash, soot, coal, particulate matter, etc. Right? The same can be said of energy. There was chemical potential energy stored in that wood, and it has since been transformed into light, heat, and sound energy. Keep this in mind when we're talking about things cycling through the ecosystem, like carbon, for example, right? These do not get destroyed or created. They only get transformed from one source to another. Speaking of sources, it's important you understand these two terms, source versus sink, and I'm not talking about your bathroom sink. A source is anywhere that produces or releases the resource. It could be carbon, it could be nitrogen, whatever, right? A sink is anything that absorbs or stores that resource. The example I like to give is that plants are a source of oxygen because we release it, or because plants release it. I'm not a plant. And humans are a sink for oxygen because they absorb it, okay? So it's important you understand those two terms. First, I want to talk about carbon because it's probably one of, if not the most important element in the entire world, and it's the reason why scientists look for its presence on other planets. It's because it forms the backbone of all life on Earth. It can form 4 covalent bonds. It makes it very versatile and allows it to form molecules like fats, but also sugars and DNA, right? So organisms need to consume a lot of carbon to keep things up and running, right? Something crazy like, I don't know, 60% of your body's carbon, or I don't know, that's not right, but something high like that. And you may have heard this term carbon cycle, but you may not actually understand what it is. How does carbon cycle through the environment? Well, here's how. Obviously, this diagram is a little bit overwhelming. This is the one in your book, but let's break it down. First of all, anything in black, or in this case white, is a sink of carbon, right? Any place where it's stored, right? Carbon is found in the atmosphere, it's found in fossil fuels, it's found in plants and the oceans. Anything in red is a process that transforms carbon from one storage place to another, right? One sink to another. The numbers represent the relative amount of carbon stored in each one. So take a look at these and see if you can't figure out which sinks are the largest. Okay, so I want to zoom in on a couple of these things, right? There's a lot going on, but I want to zoom in on the exchange between the ocean and the air, because you can see there's a lot of carbon stored here and in the oceans. I want to talk about fossil fuel extraction and combustion. I want to talk about respiration and photosynthesis, and I also want to talk a little bit about decomposition. Okay, these are the main players in the carbon cycle. So in the ocean stores a crap ton of CO2, as you can see here, 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. The phytoplankton, or algae, just tiny microscopic floating plants, absorb CO2 to do photosynthesis, and they produce oxygen. If you remember, they produce more than 50% of the world's oxygen. Not only that, but the water itself will absorb CO2. That CO2 will react with water to form carbonic acid, which is what leads to a phenomenon known as ocean acidification. Fossil fuel combustion, this is an anthropogenic activity. Anthro refers to human, and so an anthropogenic activity is a human-related activity. Combustion is this chemical reaction here. Any carbohydrate, any molecule that is a mixture of carbons and hydrogens, burned in the presence of oxygen, is going to produce carbon dioxide and water. You're doing it right now. Your mitochondria are doing it. If you breathe out, your breath will be made up of CO2 mostly and water. Your breath is wet. It's moist. But also if you burn fire or firewood, if you burn oil or coal, natural gas in your car, in your plane, in your home, whatever, you are producing CO2. So that is a major source of carbon that is getting dumped into the atmosphere, right? We've talked about this before. And another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these fossil fuels, like coal and oil, are stored deep underground, and for intents and purposes, aren't really part of the carbon cycle. When this carbon is stored deep down in here, they're not interacting with the carbon cycle. The only way that the carbon that is stored down here ends up in the carbon cycle is when we extract it and burn it. So by doing that, what we're doing is we're kind of taking a bunch of carbon that is on pause, so to speak, and extracting it and adding it to the carbon cycle that otherwise wouldn't be there, right? So that's one of the problems with burning fossil fuels, is that we're adding carbon that wouldn't necessarily even be in the atmosphere if we hadn't touched it in the first place. Another major source and cycling of carbon is respiration and photosynthesis. I mentioned that already, but humans and plants actually do cellular respiration, which releases CO2, and plants absorb CO2 in the process of photosynthesis. And lastly, decomposition. Decomposers such as worms, insects, bacteria, mushrooms will break down living organic matter, biotic tissue, and they will break it down over time and return the carbon that has died and is just laying on the ground back into sort of the food web by having fungi absorb it into their own tissue, for example. And as we talked about in class in the first week of school, the release of CO2 and the storage of CO2 are not in balance. We are releasing far more CO2 than we're able to store, so we need to plant some trees. Here's another image I like to use for the carbon cycle because it shows all the things that are adding CO2 to the atmosphere on the left and the things that absorb it on the right. Next, I want to talk about nitrogen, which, much like carbon, is a key nutrient for all living things, although it's not quite as important as carbon. No living thing can live without it, though. Nitrogen is an important component of amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And here is the image of the nitrogen cycle through your book. Remember, this number represents the size of the reservoir or the sink, and the processes are in red, and the places where it is stored are in black. So if you take a look at this, there may seem like there's a lot going on, but this is what I want you to pay attention to, right? We're going to talk a little bit about emissions and runoff of nitrogen in a second, but we're going to start by focusing on this stuff that's going on in the soil here with crops, fertilizer, bacteria, and this process called assimilation. Okay, don't get intimidated by this. We will have some practice. So in the soil, the largest reservoir of nitrogen in the world is the atmosphere. About 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. However, it is in the air as two nitrogen atoms triple bonded together. That is an extremely hard bond to break, and therefore plants can't access it on their own. They need some help. So they use the help of some bacteria. In the process of taking this nitrogen and breaking it down into a form that is more organic that plants can use is called nitrogen fixation. Bacteria that live in the root nodules of these plants that you can see here will actually fix the nitrogen from the air, and they will trade it to the plant, and in return the plant will supply carbon to them. And this is a symbiotic relationship that is only found in legumes. Legumes are beans, peanuts, green beans, most types of beans, and lentils and things like that. But not all plants have this cool mutualistic relationship. Most plants don't, as a matter of fact. So they have to rely on a variety of other steps. So here's an image of the nitrogen cycle in terms of what's happening in the soil. You can see this is what I was just talking about, the nitrogen fixing plants. Most plants don't fit into this category, though, like a zucchini, for example. So it relies on a couple of steps. So first, nitrogen in the atmosphere is going to get fixed and brought into the soil by nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria. These are basically the same thing as the ones on the plant, but they don't live on the plant. They just free float in the soil. So they convert the nitrogen in the atmosphere to ammonia. Ammonia is then nitrified by nitrifying bacteria. The process of nitrification is when ammonia gets converted into organic nitrogen, nitrates and nitrites, NO2 minus and NO3 minus. These are forms of nitrogen that can more easily be absorbed by plants, and that's exactly what's going to happen through a process known as assimilation. Plants are going to absorb this soil nitrogen, the NO3 minus and sometimes the NO2 minus, through their roots. And eventually the plants are going to die, and when decomposers start to break down the organic matter that are in these plants, they're going to turn those nitrogen compounds in that tissue back into ammonium through a process called, cleverly, ammonification. And that is going to re-enter the nitrogen cycle. So it kind of gets cycled through this little loop right here. But much like we have nitrogen entering from the atmosphere thanks to bacteria, we also have nitrogen leaving the soil back into the atmosphere thanks to bacteria. These are denitrifying bacteria. They take nitrates and they convert it back into atmospheric nitrogen. A lot of moving pieces here, but when you think about it step by step, you can break it down. I encourage you to draw this out on your notes. Here's another image of the nitrogen cycle in the soil. Here are some human-related processes associated with nitrogen. First of all, fossil fuel combustion also produces nitrogen in the form of nitrous oxides, NO and NO2. We just refer to that as NOx. This can help contribute to the formation of smog, and it can also lead to the development of acid rain, which actually will return nitrogen to the soil, but it can also lead into some disastrous impacts for statues and ecosystems. Nitrogen is also a key component in fertilizer, along with phosphorus. And in places like lawns and golf courses, they tend to over-apply fertilizer because it is cheap and abundant. And when it rains, that fertilizer, excess fertilizer, runs off, gets carried by the rain, and it gets dumped into the nearest body of water. The problem is, nitrogen is often a limiting factor for organisms to grow, for plants to grow. So if you dump a lot of it in all of a sudden, you're going to see a huge boom of algae growing in aquatic ecosystems, and that's a process called eutrophication. We don't worry about that too much. We'll talk about it in more detail later on in the year. And another cool thing about nitrogen is that thanks to a guy named Fritz Haber, we can actually artificially fixate nitrogen from the air. So we can keep creating sources of nitrogen for humans to use. Ironically, he's also the man who developed the gases that were used in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. So he had a huge impact on saving people, but also a huge impact on harming people. Okay, next I want to talk about phosphorus. We're almost done, folks. Phosphorus is important. You may remember phospholipids from freshman biology. They're a key component in cell membranes. They hinge on the presence of a phosphorus atom inside the head. So phosphorus is pretty important for cell growth, division, etc. And the phosphorus cycle, again, looks a little complicated, but it's probably the easiest of the three so far. Why don't you take a look at these here, right? These are the major things I want you to focus on. First of all, most of the phosphorus gets cycled within like a food chain, right? Plants are absorbing it from the water or the soil. Animals eat the plants. It gets cycled into the animals, but then the animals die. They get decomposed. It gets returned back into the soil. The plants take it up again, so it kind of cycles within the food chain. But there are human impacts as well. Most of the phosphorus is found in rock, sedimentary rock, and we mine that out to make more fertilizer. Phosphorus is important for fertilizer too. We mine that out. A lot of it gets weathered and eroded away and gets runs off into aquatic ecosystems, which again can lead to those algal blooms, the growth of phytoplankton, eutrophication. Some of it gets restored back into that rock, but it's a very, very slow process for phosphorus to return into the sedimentary rock. And then, of course, plants are absorbing it through their roots within the soil. Let's see here. Other important stuff about phosphorus cycle. Biggest thing is that there's no atmospheric component. Take a look at this, or take a look at this. There's no phosphorus in the air except for dust, but that doesn't really count. There's no phosphorus gas. That's not a thing. And that makes the cycling process significantly slower. Okay? Like I said, it's a major component of fertilizer, but unlike the Haber process with nitrogen, there's no way to create it artificially, so it is a limited resource and we will run out eventually, which is going to have a huge impact on our agriculture. And lastly, whereas nitrogen is limited in marine ecosystems, phosphorus tends to be limited in freshwater ecosystems. Okay, last one, the water cycle. Water cycle is the easiest one. Maybe you even know a little song about it. The water cycle is powered by the sun. The sun heats water that's on Earth's surface that evaporates, turns into water vapor, where it stores in the atmosphere. It condenses into clouds. It precipitates back down to Earth. It can infiltrate into the soil, where it can seep down into groundwater, which is where we get a lot of our drinking water. We extract a lot of that groundwater for agriculture. Fortunately, a lot of that water gets wasted. And then the last thing you should pay attention to is this new term you may not have heard before, transpiration, which is basically just evaporation, but from the leaves of plants. So plants open their stomata during the day, and water vapor leaves through those holes in their leaves, and that's a process called transpiration. So that's pretty much it for the cycles. If you've got questions, bring them to class, and I will see you next time.